So, Chanakya's chant actually is a story that I never went looking out for. It's a story that found me. I was sitting in an airport lounge, and general elections in this country had just happened, and it was almost about 10 days later, and cabinet formation hadn't happened because there was jockeying going on for cabinet berths. And when I was sitting there, I thought to myself, I said, you know, this politics of our country has become so messy. Was politics always so messy? There is a tendency in our human character, it's a human characteristic to talk about the good old days and to say that times were better. Actually, you know, honestly speaking, times weren't that great. We are living in a fairly peaceful environment as of today. And so I wanted to go back in history and see as to whether politics of the ancient world was different to the politics of today. And obviously, when one talks about real politics, then the one figure that comes to your mind is Chanakya. And so it gave me a chance to go back and explore the Mauryan dynasty and to explore Chandragupta Maurya's time and Chanakya and his philosophy and his Arthashastra. So this was a book where actually there are two parallel timelines. There are two stories in this book. One is a story which is 2,300 years ago, which describes what Chanakya is doing in order to make Chandragupta Maurya into the emperor of Bharat. And on the other hand, there is a modern day parallel. There is a person born in Kanpur. His name is Pandit Ganga Sagar Mishra, and he has read the Arthashastra, and he is inspired by Chanakya, and he picks up one girl from a slum. Her name is Chandni, and he says, "Come on, sweetheart, I will make you into the next prime minister." And he applies the same principles of Chanakya in order to achieve his political aim. And so both of these stories develop in parallel in the book, and the intention is to be able to explore the fact that things weren't too different and that human nature has essentially remained the same down the ages, that props have changed, that there is the old saying that politics is war without bloodshed. So today we have elections, and we topple governments, and we buy votes, and we create no confidence motions. So we have all of that happening in order to settle political disputes. And in the ancient day, we took chariots and elephants and horses, and we went to war. But the fundamental nature of the game, the motivations, have not changed. Those have remained constant. You know, at the end of the day, when you read the Arthashastra, you realize that Chanakya was one of those who was actually interested in creating almost an ideal state. So for him, an emperor was simply a means to an end. The closest that I can come to describing the Arthashastra is the ancient day equivalent of a modern report by a consulting firm like a McKinsey outlining how a country or a state should be run. Because Chanakya was more interested in what should be the ideal width of a road so that two chariots can pass one another. He was more interested in how deep should the treasury be so that looters can't reach it. He was more interested in how could he rather than being moralistic about discouraging people from drinking, on the contrary, he prescribed cocktail recipes which were to be used in the liquor dens and taverns so that he could tax them. So Chanakya's intention was basically to have that perfect administrative state, and the emperor was nothing else but a means towards being able to achieve that. Yes, there is that bit of Chanakya which we consider to be Chanakya Niti, as it were, the real politic, which is what gets spoken about much more. but that was a very small part of his actual teaching. He was much more of an economist, much more of an administrator, much more of a bureaucrat, much more of a person concerned about good governance than he was about realpolitik. And I wish, if I was looking in modern terms, I sometimes wish that we were to learn a little more from his manual of governance rather than from his manual on realpolitik. No, it covers both actually, because my own personal view is that what made Chanakya great was not only the fact that he had that innate ability to be able to, a simple thing like my enemy's enemy is my friend. It's a very simple line, but it pretty much describes what his political vision was. But it cannot describe the reams that he ended up writing in terms of micromanaging an economy. And that is where I genuinely believe that I have attempted in Chanakya's chant to emphasize the governance, and the fact that it's almost like my yearning for good governance, which I have expressed in the form of a fictional story. The Arthashastra was obviously the starting point. In the case of Chanakya, the one interesting bit to note is that while Chanakya wrote a lot, including the Arthashastra and the Niti Shastra, but the fact is that very little was actually written about Chanakya himself as a historical figure. So most of our story about Chanakya, we are dependent on a Sanskrit play which is known as the Mudra Rakshas. And the Mudra Rakshas was written a good 700 to 900 years after Chanakya lived. So we do not know as to whether the Mudra Rakshas was written by someone who was attempting to put down historical facts, or was he another Ashwin Sanghi playing with fiction and fact. So how much of it is fact and how much of it is fiction is very difficult to discern. So you have to cherry pick. So Mudra Rakshas became an important source of information, and then of course there are many secondary and tertiary sources. So for example, the Greeks wrote substantial accounts of Chandragupta as well as the administration of his state. So those again became extremely valuable. For example, you had the Greek ambassador Megasthenes, who wrote Indica, where he described his journey into India, and he's actually described his meeting with Chanakya. So those first-hand accounts become extremely important when you're constructing a book like this. Absolutely, where I felt that there was a need to be able to get an alternative point of view of a historian, I did, and I do that across the board. But I do that more because I want a secondary source to tell me that yes, you're thinking on the right lines. There will often be situations where I'll take a completely contrary posture to what a modern historian would take, in which case if the story demands it, I will do that, but I will be particular enough to find a source which can corroborate what I want. So to that extent, I mean, for me the story takes precedence over the material. At the end of the day, the way I see it is that my primary objective is to entertain you as the reader, and then if along the way I also somewhat educate and somewhat enlighten, that's fine, but that's a byproduct. Absolutely, because what we have shown is the only difference that I have attempted to show is that the props have changed. So to that extent, I mean, an ancient Chanakya would not have had, for example, the tools of ancient propaganda tools at his disposal, whereas a modern politician does. So the concept of using propaganda has been covered rather extensively in Chanakya's chant, or the fact that alliances or taking specifically, creating alliances in order to get your way. That has again been described in substantial amount of detail. The idea that you could win without being an outright winner. That is again very much part of our modern day democracy, where seats are not decided necessarily by the majority view. They are simply decided by the fact that whether votes have been split or not. So there are many modern day parallels to the ancient day politics, and I have tried to bring those out, that contrast between the modern and the ancient, and at the same time the similarity. I think the one message that comes across in Chanakya's chant is that history repeats itself, and the only one constant. There's the old proverb which says the only constant is change. To my mind, the constant is the fact that man doesn't learn, and that's the reason why history repeats itself, because we don't learn from our mistakes. We'd like to think that we do, but we don't, and as a result of which we see the same pattern recurring again and again and again. And for me, it is that pattern which is more interesting than the story itself.